Church will be at its best when we begin our conversations on technology, not with apps or IT infrastructure, but with culture. That's a quote from Ryan Panzer, who is our adjunct professor on this session of Pastoring in the Digital Parish. Ryan has formerly worked at innovative companies like Google, you may have heard of them, and Zendesk, while also staying heavily involved in the church and faith development. He has brought these two spheres together as he pursues a call to build a bridge really between tech and church, exploring what it means to do effective ministry in digital culture. Ryan Panzer is author of Grace and Gigabytes and the upcoming The Holy and the Hybrid. And in this session, we're going to explore together the digital reformation that is overtaking our culture and really infiltrating our churches. Ryan shares how the church can bridge the analog and the digital, as well as offering some speculation on the church of the future. My name is also Ryan. I'm Ryan Dunn, the host of Pastoring in the Digital Parish and a fellow practitioner of digital ministry. And Pastoring in the Digital Parish is your resource and connection for growing faith communities in the digital world. We've kicked off season 4, and this is one of 3 episodes that we've released to start the season. The other 2 both complement this session incredibly well, as Andrew Root gave us some diagnosis of digital culture, and Shamika Clausen provided ideas for embracing technology while offering grace and dignity and alleviating anxiety. So don't stop with this session. But before you click away, let's get to know Ryan Panzer on Pastoring in the Digital Parish. Ryan Panzer, we're so pleased to have you on Pastoring in the Digital Parish. I hope you're doing well today.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. It's great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You bet. Well, I want to set the table for us a little bit in our conversation. Why is it so important for church leaders to understand digital culture here in 2022?
Well, the main reason is that digital culture and digital technology are 2 different things. You know, when you look at the ways that digital technology is influencing the way we think, the way we learn, the way we relate to one another, this is a steady and ongoing and accelerating change that's really going to have dramatic effects on what it means to be a church leader for years and decades to come. And I separate that out from digital technologies because, you know, if you look at the MySpaces and the Napsters of the past, you know, digital technology has a remarkably short shelf life, and it's getting shorter and shorter with each passing year. So one of the first things I talk to church leaders about is to think less about the apps and the tools that you're using to do digital ministry, and think more about how digital technology brings us together, the ways we relate to one another differently while online, because those are the questions that are going to linger, that are going to matter, even after the apps that are on all of our phones right now have gone bankrupt and been acquired by some other company.
Yeah. Well, unpack that for us a little bit. Like, what are some of the ways that we are relating differently now in a digital culture?
Sure. Well, you know, if you think about just the interactions that people tend to have in digital spaces, a lot of them have to do with questions and discussion and conversation. And so the digital age gives us these platforms where you can more easily than ever have multi-directional conversations with communities that may never set foot in the same physical space. You know, a really good example of this is a Slack channel where you have all these people who have never met coming together around a common topic, sharing reactions, ideas, questions, things that are on their mind. And so that is the structure of how communication really works in a digital age. That's quite a bit different from if you think about the way churches have evolved to operate. You know, if you look at churches from the era of the Protestant Reformation with the pulpits, you know, several feet above all of the rows of pews, it was very much a one-way flow of information, where information would flow from a preacher to an audience of passive receivers. So that's something that we need to be cognizant of, that communication itself has changed, and the way folks expect to be in community, to be involved in the dialogue, has changed. And that's going to have implications for what it means to lead Christian community.
It seems like Wikipedia might be a good analogy for this. Do you think that's fair, where we have kind of almost the user generated, or, at least communal type information process?
Yeah, I think actually Wikipedia is an excellent analog, both in what it says about what's great about digital spaces, where anyone can contribute their expertise, and also what's not so great, where you can contribute things that are flat out wrong, that fly in the face of conventional wisdom or facts. And I think Wikipedia writes large some of the challenges and not just some of the benefits of this digital age.
We both come out of traditions where the training for leadership is pretty heavy duty in terms of who gets vested with authority within the church. So do you see that changing a little bit in digital culture? Like, is the authority vested by a denomination per se really that important to people living in a digital first age?
I think a lot of synods, judicatories, church-wide bodies are trying to figure out that same question and wrestle with it right now. Certainly we're living in a time where job titling and credentialing just doesn't mean what it used to, in an age where a 16-year-old with a Twitch account can have as many followers as an established pastor with a healthy and vibrant church following. So it certainly presents some challenges. I think perhaps one of the pivotal shifts in church leadership is that it's less important to perhaps be a source of authority, and more important to be fluent in convening and moderating conversations. There's a resource I like to point folks to. It was created by Kyle Oliver and a few of the folks at Virginia Theological Seminary, which is a ministry of the Episcopal Church. It's called the Digital Literacy Toolkit. And what Kyle and company did is they looked at all of the skills that church leaders might need for a digital age. And one of the skills that they recommend, one of the literacies they recommend, is becoming fluent in convening digital conversations. That means knowing what questions to ask on what platforms, how to moderate the conversations when there's no engagement or when they veer off course, and how to ultimately connect folks across time and space.
Yeah, so I'm tweaked then, because I've had a few, let's say a few conversations that didn't seem to garner much engagement.
Yeah.
What were some of their suggestions?
Well, I think one of the common traits you would find within those recommendations is just to have a certain resilience, to understand that most conversations are likely to falter. I found some statistic recently about the number of podcast episodes that are never downloaded, and it's something like 60% or more of episodes are never even listened to. And so the default experience online is actually not one of viral videos and TikTok millionaires. It's one of working really hard to create something thoughtful and having no one show up to the conversation.
Yeah. It can be a bit like sermon generating. Like,
it can be, yeah.
My experience, you work totally hard on a sermon and you're ready to go, and you present your sermon and you think, I just nailed it, and nobody responds. And then the Sunday where you were like, I just wrestled a bear, I don't know what I said, people are like, that is just what I needed to hear today.
That spoke to me at a very deep level. Yeah. I have certainly been there myself.
Well, we're in this period of change. You use the phrase digital reformation to describe this period that we're in within the church. What are some symptoms or some key takeaways of the digital reformation?
Sure. So I actually didn't come up with this term. The term was coined by a professor named Elizabeth Drescher, and she's written a great deal about ministry in a digital age. She has a fantastic book called Choosing Our Religion, which is about the spiritual lives of America's nuns and millennials and Gen Z. Fascinating read. But she kind of helped me to think about the digital reformation as a turning of the church to recognizing a different sense of place within our communities. And so it changed from our communities being rooted in a physical neighborhood place to being rooted in a both and, that's online and offline simultaneously. And so when you think about what is actually being reformed or remade, more so than any streaming technologies or social media, what's really being remade is our sense of where ministry happens, of the sites where ministry conversations take place, where worship occurs. And increasingly that Reformation is moving us into a both and world, online and offline. Reformations are a bit dizzying. They move quickly, and oftentimes they move faster than we can sort out all of the implications. And so one of the questions that most church leaders are thinking through right now is, well, my attendance in the sanctuary is 30 to 40% what it was in March 2020. What do I make of that? And that's really that pull of placefulness, that change in the place where our ministry happens. That is not an easy place to be. It's not a comfortable place to be asking that question. And so Reformation, I think, is a word that I use with a bit of hesitancy, because in some ways it almost seems like it's meant to be uplifting and positive. There are some positive aspects of it, but unfortunately the reality of going through a time like this is it can be unsettling and disruptive to a lot of our community.
Yeah, there was an opinion piece that my organization, United Methodist Communications, recently published that was really reflective of that. This opinion piece suggested that the church has a call to pull people off of their devices. I sense that you might disagree with that a little bit. Why might we need to be cautious about that kind of statement?
Well, I think the statement is valid in certain cases. When I was in college, I worked at an outdoor summer camp. You had a strict no phones policy, and it was the best week of the summer for every kid who showed up. And I think they would be reluctant to give up their phones at the start of the week, and would be reluctant to turn them back on once they were given back at the end of the week. The question of how we plug in is very important right now, both for our leaders and our communities alike. We should be thinking about what are the moments where it makes sense to have some digital integration, and where we need to promote a sense of digital Sabbath or unplugging completely. One thing I found pretty cool is when I've sent social media messages to some of the pastors who have big followings on Instagram and Twitter, and I like to ask them for tips or suggestions or ideas. And one of the things that they share with me almost every time is they have a commitment to digital Sabbath, to unplugging themselves. Usually it's Sunday after worship, where they just turn all of their devices off. There's going to be a time for creating blog posts and podcasts, and creating TikTok videos where you dress up in clerical garb and such. But we're a church community that needs to figure out a sense of rest, a sense of disconnect as well. That's that Sabbath rhythm that's grounded in all of creation. So I think the advice to disconnect from our devices is wise in a certain sense. I think what needs to be added to it is, but in what moments, and figuring that out.
Those pastors who you were soliciting some information from, have they ever been or indicated any kind of criteria or guidelines about oversharing?
What's interesting is I come from a tradition where when Facebook just launched, I was working as a youth ministry intern, and I went to a synod assembly. So in the Lutheran world, we have these big synod assemblies, and Facebook, at the time, every high school kid had already adopted Facebook, and the convener of the assembly was talking about trends in ministry, and she asked everybody to raise their hand if they had a Facebook page. And, in this room of maybe 400 pastors and church leaders, this is back in 2007, you maybe had 2 or 3 that raised their hands. And I think perhaps too often we're too slow to try technologies, and we actually share too little in a sense that we don't engage the platform at all. TikTok is a perfect example of this. A lot of churches don't have a strategy for TikTok, so as a result, they're not doing TikTok. In some ways, it's not a time to have a strategy. It's just time to be playful and creative and see what you can come up with. But I think you asked about oversharing, and I've also experienced the other side of this, where pastors have seen their communities damaged by things that were shared that maybe didn't belong in a community. So going back to some of Kyle Oliver's work with that digital literacy toolkit, it also talks about being spiritually wise and discerning about what and when to share something online.
I was resonating with what you were saying about TikTok. Is churches opened up to the idea of jumping onto TikTok. I've interviewed a number of people who have had some success on TikTok, and nearly 100% of them have said, when I got onto TikTok, I had no idea what I was doing.
Correct.
I was just there kind of playing around with it. I didn't know what I would use it for. So there is that invitation to just kind of get in and get involved and to try and accept some failures along the way, and yet still to go for it. You've shared some great thoughts about creating digital community. What are some of the things that you've noticed that churches miss when they seek to create communities online?
Well, I think one of the ideas that is still around is that community can easily be invented online. Like if we just create a Facebook group, people will show up for the conversation. And so one of the things I write about in the first book, Grace and Gigabytes, is how what often precedes digital community is some form of analog interaction. And I tell some stories of congregations who have done things like a food truck ministry or a coffee shop ministry and use that as the launching pad for digital conversations. The content saturation online is significant, and there's many conversations that folks can plug into. And so if we think that if we just create this page, we create this resource, and people are going to appear there, I think we're likely to be to not see much traction with that. So think about what analog or physical antecedents or things need to happen before you create the digital community. The other thing too that I think is useful is specificity and identity. When folks go online, they're often looking for something that's highly specific. That's the reason why literary TikTok is so popular. Like one of the most vibrant communities on TikTok is people who like to read very literary authors, book nerds like myself. It's a very specific audience that's seeking out something very specific, which is reviews of literary fiction. When we create community, creating Christian community is quite a broad concept. What type of Christian community do you want to create? What do you want to be known for? And who could be part of that community? These are questions we should be asking.
Yeah. So it sounds like almost identifying a niche. Correct.
Yeah. The more niche our digital community becomes, the more vibrant it's likely to be.
And the promise that comes with that then is that we can also provide some guidelines around those communities as well, which helps us assuage some of the fears that we might have in engaging in social media, right? Because there are all these ideas about how social media can be divisive. We get trolled. People just want to have arguments. But if we're able to be niche, then we can say, for example, hey, this is a community in which we talk about literary fiction.
Correct.
And that's where we guide this. We can, for church world, we may want to say, this is where we talk about literary fiction through the lens of the gospel. And we want to keep our posts centered on that. So that gives us a bit of a safer space, which actually encourages more conversation, I believe.
Yeah, I've seen countless examples of what you just described in social media channels. That is an act of bravery to step into that space and say, actually, this is the conversation we've stepped onto this platform to have. Other conversations we'll pivot away from. So having some clarity into what type of community we're going to create is useful. the design thinking process is a great methodology for discerning the type of community that you're seeking to create. And if you're not familiar with design thinking, it's a methodology that has its roots at Stanford University and a firm called IDEO, IDEO. It looks at a process of empathizing and understanding needs and requirements and shaping some kind of experience and reaction to that. It's a brilliant design methodology that can be used in all types of settings and organizations. And a lot of churches are starting to turn to that as they think about what they want to create for the future.
In developing these communities, you talked about almost having an impulse that begins in the analog. That's where you begin to, I guess, build the inertia. Have you seen some creative ways that churches are bridging the analog and the digital?
Well, yes. And I've also seen a lot of ways that have led to frustration, and maybe I'll speak to that first. I think that what leads to frustration is where we assume that everything analog also needs to be digital. And so we lug our multimedia equipment to the park for church in the park, or we put a laptop on the bar for beers and Bibles. And the experience isn't great for anybody involved. So the first step in knowing the way to build bridges between analog and physical is knowing where you're not going to attempt to build bridges between analog and digital. And once you figured out what you're going to say no to, it becomes easier to say yes to a few things that are more strategic or of greater importance. I'm just starting a little bit of a pilot program at the church I work with here in Wisconsin, where we're going to try to create through our preaching some digital content that is shared Monday through Friday after a sermon is preached, so we can go back to some of the themes that were introduced in the sermon and introduced through that week's gospel message, and kind of expand on them through blog posts and social media, maybe some digital video. It's still in an early stage, but that's one of those examples. Maybe your worship is live streamed, maybe it's not, but most churches have a sermon on Sunday. How can you create short snippets of digital content that remind folks of the messages, that add to them, that bring in perspectives you weren't able to bring in on Sunday morning?
Yeah, and I love that idea because it's so accessible in terms of being with people all the time. Maybe prior to 2020, many of us in ministry lamented that we had such a finite amount of time to be with people and to build relationships with people. Often that was just defined by the Sunday morning event, right? We had an hour to 90 minutes to actually spend with people. Well, the digital world opens us up to being able to asynchronously be present with people.
Correct.
All week long. And there is a great way of kind of revisiting our common shared time throughout the week as well. And those bonds of relationships grow stronger through that.
Absolutely.
As you're building this system out with your church, it sounds like what you're doing is you're taking the video from the Sunday sermon and carving up some snippets out of that. Is that something that the pastor has to do, or is there a team that comes behind something like that?
So good question. So the church where I attend with my family is, fortunate to have a media team with some interns who are part of that process. The question I often get is, what do you do about the church that has a staff of one, and how do you make that work? A couple of just very practical ideas, one of which is understand what technologies can help to automate this work. The pan-tilt zoom camera has been a true game changer for live streaming worship services, because nobody needs to look into the camera as they record. In fact, it can even track your movements across the sanctuary if you wear a special tracker that a lot of those cameras now come with. We're also living in the gig economy. Websites like Fiverr offer freelancers who are willing to support our content development efforts often at a fraction of the cost of hiring a full-time employee. Sometimes it's just somebody who's looking for some side income. Sometimes it's folks who do this for full-time employment. But we now have an entire marketplace of media professionals who can assist with that work. The other thing I'll say is churches, I think, sometimes look at this conversation as, how do I create all this new content? And we are a tradition that is already inundated with content. If you got a 12 to 20 minute sermon, you have pages and pages of content. Jim Keat, who's one of my favorite influencers in the world of digital ministry, advises churches to say, look at your sermon texts, copy and paste a few lines you like, and make Facebook posts out of it. There's your intro to digital content.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Yeah, because I think another one of the fears that we have in terms of digital ministry is that it feels like it's adding so much more to the plate. And if you're a solo pastor, the plate's already full, right? So having to think, oh, well, now I have to caretake for almost the split campus of a digital ministry feels daunting to the point that we just don't have the bandwidth personally to engage in that. So using that idea that, hey, here is a way for us to advance in ministry based on the content that we've already spent hours creating, and being able to use that to continue a relationship with people beyond our Sunday morning event is crucial. I love that idea.
And it's just so interesting how when we talk about hybrid or digital, everybody immediately jumps to the assumption that we always have to be online with everything we do, that every worship service needs a live stream. If you really think about what hybrid ministry is all about, it's creating ministry connections in analog and cyberspace. You can do that with one Facebook post a week. You don't have to live stream your worship service in its entirety. So the art of saying no, of stepping back from what doesn't feel like we have the bandwidth for, is an essential ministry and leadership skill for this time we're navigating.
Do you have some criteria that you think about in terms of what makes for good digital ministry and what makes for good analog ministry?
Yeah.
Let me clarify that question a little bit. Sorry. In terms of how you think about what you're going to share in digital space and what just needs to stay in analog space.
It's a very good question. You know, the best example I can come up with is still the outdoor camping ministry. Is like, and even then, the camp I worked at now has a podcast that's, I think, a really good podcast. So maybe that's not even as much of an example as what it was. It's difficult to say, you know, full stop, this is what should be online, this is what should be offline. Some churches have said these are embodied practices, these need to be offline, yet when you're doing something physically or virtually, you are still an embodied being. And walking around the neighborhood as you listen to a podcast devotion on, through your AirPods is still an embodied act. So it's really difficult to say categorically, this belongs online, this belongs offline. I think rather than saying prescriptively, this is what should be online, this is what should be offline, we should be thinking about what questions we should ask ourselves as a community to discern just that. And if we can become practiced in the art of discernment and asking those questions, we can discover how we can answer that in the particularities of our ministry.
You wrote about putting the digital participant within the front row. Is that something that you consider when you think about like what belongs in digital space?
Yeah, certainly. The pre-pandemic digital experience was the back row visitor who always had the back row or even the balcony vantage point on worship as it was recorded. And so the what I was getting at with the book is, if you're going to do something digital, how can you integrate a virtual community in a way that makes them feel like they have a front row seat? And maybe that is like as tangible as your video production, and you're going to put a camera in the front pew And that way, somebody watching online does in fact have a front row seat on the worship service. But it could also be thinking about there might be aspects of your ministry that are better when they're done digitally. Book discussions are a great example. I'm part of a congregation where we had our highest ever attendance at book discussions during COVID because people who put their kids to bed were able to jump on Zoom at 8 o'clock to talk about a book. And so when you think about that front row seat, you might also ask yourself the question, are there aspects of our life together that are best held digitally and that we may not even need an analog component for?
That's good. Well, I feel like certainly we're in the midst of the digital Reformation. I feel like this Reformation is going to continue on for a little while. So as you put on your prognosticator hat, how is ministry, I guess even professional ministry, going to look different in 5 years?
Well, the idea of a Reformation is that it's an ongoing process and, it might take decades, if not hundreds of years to fully work itself out. But when we look at 5 years ahead, one thing that I won't predict, but I'll say it's a hope of mine, is that churches and resource and judicatories and synods and church-wide bodies will become more collaborative and less siloed. We saw during COVID how some churches would bring in a preacher from across the country to preach on a particular topic, or bishops who are participating on Zoom worships like they'd never done before in some cases. And so digital offers this ability to collaborate and co-create like we haven't experienced before in the church. In the next 5 years, I'd like to see us get a lot more fluent and regular at doing just that, at reaching out, at building connections, at understanding who we can invite into the conversation that maybe wouldn't have been invited previously. I don't know at a very concrete level what that's going to look like, but if we figure out how to share resources more effectively, then it addresses that question of sustainability and burnout. And perhaps gives ourselves a reprieve from some of the feeling of, I just have so much to do all the time.
Yeah. The sense of invitation gets broader, I think. And
well said.
There are a couple of really exciting things about that. I mean, first is for the solo pastor who feels the pressure of having to prepare something fresh every week that maybe now can say, well, my friend from seminary who's several states away can actually offer a sermon for me this week. But also we have a chance to diversify, the famous quip from Martin Luther King Jr. that Sunday morning is the most least diverse or most segregated hour of the week. We have a chance now to maybe chink away at that a little bit, put some cracks in that by being very deliberate in who we invite to come before our congregations.
Absolutely. Certainly.
Yeah. Well, Ryan, what's coming next for you?
Well, the book is coming out September 27th. That's titled The Holy and the Hybrid, Navigating the Church's Digital Reformation. It's not about hybrid vehicles. It's about hybrid ministry. And It's just a short, accessible guide to navigating this both and church landscape. I'm also really excited to kick off this pilot at my church here in Madison, Wisconsin, where we're going to be experimenting with integrating some digital content with some of the questions we're first asking through preaching. So it's an exciting time. I'll also continue to write and accompany churches as they ask some of these questions.
Cool. And as they do come up with questions, where can they get a hold of you?
Just hop onto my website, www.ryanpanzer.com. There's a contact me form. I love getting questions, comments, feedback, criticism. It's sometimes those who disagree with the ideas in the book that I have the best conversations with. So please let me know what you think, and would love to be in conversation.
Cool. Well, Ryan Panzer, thank you so much for giving this time to us today and for sharing a little bit about the holy and the hybrid and what the pastorate is going to look like in a few years.
Thank you, Ryan. Great to be here.
All right, friend, if this session was meaningful for you, the best thing that you can do is to listen to another episode. Certainly, the other releases at the beginning of season 4 here complement this episode really well. I'm Ryan Dunn. I would like to thank resourceumc.org, the online destination for leaders throughout the United Methodist Church. They make this podcast possible. And of course, they host our website, pastoringinthedigitalparish.com, where you can find more online resources for ministry. If you want to connect, check out our Pastoring in the Digital Parish group on Facebook. You can also send me questions and ideas for future sessions at digitalparish@umcom.org. I'll speak with you again in a new episode next week. In the meantime, peace to you.